Today we're exploring the question, what is Christian apologetics? So in 1 Peter chapter 3, verse 15, we are told to always be prepared to give an answer to everyone who asks you to give the reason for the hope that you have. There, the word translated as answer comes from the Greek word apologia, which means to give a reasoned defense. So in other words, when people ask questions about Christian belief, Christians are called to give clear and reasoned responses, showing that their faith is not just personally meaningful, but it is intellectually defensible and open to rational examination. Because as John Lennox puts it, faith is a response to evidence, not a rejoicing in the absence of evidence. And so in this video, we're going to explore 4 different types of apologetics, 4 different types of approaches to ways we can look at different evidences for the Christian faith. The first approach is called classical apologetics. It uses philosophy and logic to explore questions like, does God exist? And if so, is Christianity true? So classical apologetics arguments usually use deductive reasoning. They argue that if certain premises are true, then a specific conclusion logically follows from those premises. So here's a couple of examples. The first one is called the moral argument, and it goes like this. If God does not exist, then objective moral values and duties do not exist. Objective moral values and duties do exist, therefore God exists. Or another one is called the fine-tuning argument, and it goes like this. The fine-tuning of the universe is due to either physical necessity, chance, or design. It is not due to physical necessity or chance, therefore it is due to design. I'll give you one more example. This one is called the cosmological argument, and it goes, whatever begins to exist has a cause. The universe began to exist, therefore the universe has a cause. And so what we're doing here is we are thinking through questions one step at a time. Once we establish the reasonableness of God, we can call that step 1, we can then move forward and figure out what we know about this God. So with the moral argument, for example, once we establish that moral values exist and that they require a foundation beyond human opinion, and if that foundation is God, then we can logically deduce that moral values reflect God's nature and therefore what God approves and disapproves of. Or with the cosmological argument, if we establish that the universe has a cause, then we can say that that cause must be outside of space and time and matter, since those things began with the universe. And then if the universe began at a finite point in time, we could say that the cause must be able to initiate a beginning. And we know an impersonal force wouldn't be able to choose to start anything, only a mind can do that. So the cause would have to be a personal creator, something with a mind. And notice that this isn't manipulation or wordplay. It is just straightforward reasoning. We are asking what best explains reality and then methodically following the logic where it leads. The second approach, presuppositional apologetics, starts a step even further back. So instead of asking, does God exist? It asks what has to be true for logic and morality and reasoning to make sense in the first place. So classical apologetics might say, hey, let's reason together and see where the reasoning leads. And presuppositional apologetics suggests that without God, we might not have a solid foundation for reasoning for logic in the first place. Cornelius von Til, he said, I hold that belief in God is not merely as reasonable as other belief, or even a little or infinitely more probably true than other belief. I hold rather that unless you believe in God, you can logically believe in nothing else. And here's what I think he means. We all rely on different laws of logic. For example, we rely on the law of non-contradiction, which says that something cannot be true and false at the same time in the same way. So it can't be raining and not raining in the same place at the same time. Or something cannot be both a square and not a square, like a square circle. That's not possible. We also rely on the law of identity, which says that something is what it is, like a chair is a chair. It's not a tree or a cloud. And when someone says chair, we assume that the word keeps the same meaning throughout the conversation. Similarly, mathematical truths, they do not depend on opinion or geography. So in standard arithmetic, 2 + 2 = 4, whether you're in New York or Nairobi. And even when we're disagreeing, we are assuming that these laws of logic work, that good reasoning will ultimately lead to true conclusions. And this all raises a deeper question. Why should we trust human reasoning at all? Because our minds often rely on shortcuts that help us survive without being perfectly accurate. Like we might assume that some rustling in the bushes means danger. And that response can be useful even when it's wrong. And I say this because it shows us that usefulness is not the same thing as truth. So what explains why human reasoning is reliable for discovering truth rather than merely helping us survive? Presuppositional apologetics would propose that reasoning works because reality itself is grounded in a rational source. That because logical laws are not physical objects but are universal and unchanging, they appear to be discovered rather than invented. And Christianity then offers a specific explanation that humans are made in God's image, which accounts for why our minds are capable of reasoning and then knowing truth. And this is not inserting God where explanations fail, but it's asking what underlying reality would make logic and rationality possible in the first place. The third approach is called evidential apologetics. So instead of starting with philosophical arguments for God, it begins with publicly accessible records, historical records, scientific findings. It gathers the available evidence, and then it compares competing worldviews to determine which explanation, which worldview best fits the data. So I recently read the book God in the Dark by Os Guinness, and there's a quote from it that captures the spirit of evidential apologetics really well. He says, "The uniqueness and trustworthiness of the Christian faith rest entirely on its claim to be the truth. God, who is the Father of Jesus Christ, is either there or he is not there. Either he has spoken or he has not spoken. What his revelation claims is either true or false. Jesus either rose from the dead or he didn't. If it claims to be true, it must be willing to show the areas in which the evidence for its claims can be examined and found to be true." And then this is my favorite part. He says, "At this point, the Christian faith is not only willing, it is eager." So as I mentioned, evidential apologetics does include scientific findings like the cosmological evidence for the beginning of the universe, or the apparent fine-tuning of the universe's physical constants that allow for life, or the mathematical intelligibility of nature, or the complexity of biological information like DNA. But often the focus here is on the life, death, and resurrection of Jesus, so historical stuff. And that's because if the resurrection is historically credible, then it becomes really powerful evidence for Jesus's claims and for Christianity itself. So the historical records include strong evidence for the existence of Jesus of Nazareth, his crucifixion under Pontius Pilate, the early belief of his followers that Jesus rose from the dead, the rapid growth of the Christian movement despite persecution, references to early Christians in non-Christian sources, archaeological confirmation of the New Testament's historical context, and arguments based on fulfilled Old Testament prophecies. The main disagreements are not about whether any of these things I just listed, any of these events and beliefs existed, but about how they should be explained. So Christians, of course, argue that the resurrection provides the most coherent explanation of the historical evidence, and that the alternative explanations that have been presented are less able to account for the full range of data. For example, there is widespread scholarly agreement that Jesus' early followers sincerely did believe that they encountered Jesus after his death. This is supported by both Christian and non-Christian historical sources. And so alternative explanations proposed to account for this include things like, oh, they were hallucinating or they were deliberately deceptive. But these have significant challenges because hallucinations, for example, are typically individual experiences. There's no evidence that they are shared experiences. Or, for example, the willingness of the early followers to suffer and die for their claims suggests sincerity rather than intentional fabrication. And again, we're not manipulating or cherry picking or fabricating data. We are just honestly evaluating the evidence that's available to all of us and then asking which explanation makes the most sense of it. The fourth approach is called experiential apologetics. So instead of starting with primarily philosophical arguments or historical evidence, it begins with widely reported features of the human experience and then asks what worldview best accounts for them. So one example of this is our common human existential experience, our shared sense that life has meaning beyond survival. And this includes things like our common desire to know that our lives matter, to be loved, to understand why we're here, to want good things to last, our resistance to the idea that death is the end, or how even when life is going well and we have friends and we have financial stability and we have security and enjoyable experiences, when all of our needs are met, that many of us are still asking, is this all there is? And some people argue that this longing is really just the result of psychology and evolution, but experiential apologetics suggests that it may be better understood as reflecting a real desire capable of fulfillment. That just like hunger corresponds to food and thirst corresponds to water, that this persistent longing may be consistent with humans being oriented towards a relationship with God. So C.S. Lewis wrote, "If I find in myself desires which nothing in this world can satisfy, the only logical explanation is that I was made for another world." Another example of experiential apologetics is religious or spiritual experience. This includes commonly reported experiences like specific answers to specific prayers, or feeling God's presence, or experiencing a significant personal change after becoming a Christian. Here, there's no single experience that's being presented as definitive proof that God exists or that Christianity is true. Rather, experiential apologetics just looks at this repeated pattern of similar experiences that happen across cultures and throughout time, and it treats that pattern as data that needs an explanation. So if reality is entirely impersonal, if it consists only of matter, only of energy, then widespread reports of encountering a personal presence is difficult to account for. But if a personal God exists, then accounts like these aren't really surprising. In fact, they make a lot of sense within a worldview that includes a personal God. They make more sense in a worldview that includes a personal God than in a worldview without one. So like other approaches, here the goal isn't emotional persuasion or manipulation. It's just to take the full range of available evidence seriously. And in this case, it's the human experience, and then ask which explanation best accounts for that. So to summarize, classical apologetics presents philosophical arguments about God. Presuppositional apologetics examines the foundations that make reasoning possible. Evidential apologetics evaluates historical and scientific evidence, and then experiential apologetics considers personal and existential experience as part of the evidence for Christianity. Okay, so these approaches, they are not intended to compete with one another, but rather they address different types of evidence, all working together, helping us compare worldviews, and then considering whether Christianity provides the best overall explanation of the evidence. And this brings us back to 1 Peter chapter 3, verse 15. Because being familiar with the different types of evidence for Christianity does help us always be prepared to give answers for the hope that is in us. But the verse doesn't stop there. We are also told to do this with gentleness and respect, remembering that how we defend our faith matters just as much as the arguments that we make. Or as R.C. Sproul puts it, apologetics is not merely about winning an argument, it is about winning souls. In the comments, I'm curious, which apologetics approach do you resonate with the most? Or, which one had the biggest influence on your faith? And then I've got a couple of personal questions too, which, maybe you can just think about if you don't want to share, but are you willing to follow the logic where it leads, even if it challenges assumptions you've held for a long time? And as you grow in understanding, are you also growing in gentleness and respect? Of course, if you have questions about this topic or other topics related to Christianity or apologetics, please add those to the comments as well, and I will do my best to respond there or in a future video. And if you want to see more content like this, you can click the subscribe button just below the video, and I'll see you next week. Thanks.